Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast, where we demystify the creative process and exchange ideas with career-minded artists. We are your hosts, Adriana M.A. and
Jackie Sanders. We're two emerging artists sharing for the advice and business lessons we have learned along our journey. So if you're not already, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we launch a new episode every Tuesday. On this week's episode, we're going to be talking about ways to invest in yourself and your art in order to really just reignite your inspiration, your passion, and your creative vision. Because in addition to creative warm-ups and just getting your hands moving, there are some action items outside of your usual practice that can really help if you're feeling that creative block. So they may involve investing some money or time, because especially when you think about the traditional way of how we typically learn things from academia or from school perspective, you have to invest time and money in order to move forward with anything that we do, any skill, any knowledge-based activity. And so doing that with yourself and your artwork is the same exact thing.
Yeah, it is. It's like, think about it. Nobody was born knowing how to read novels. So you kind of learn throughout the grades and, your typical school structure in order to where you are today as an adult. So we think this is kind of reflected once you've left school. It's important to continue to do that for yourself and your art. And some of the things that we're going to be discussing are, brainstorming ideas to whether it's like you're in a creative block, which happens to everyone, especially if you've been going full speed and then now you don't know where to go next. Maybe you're trying to conceptually begin a new series of work and you're just trying to get some ideas on where to go next, or you just need to take a break from your routine, which, believe it or not, sometimes even in art, you can fall into routines, and then take the time to play and experiment, because a lot of times that's what gives you the big ideas on what's coming next, and or it just acts as a resting point from all the other stuff you're doing that you may start to overthink, and then you just got to take a step back. So by taking some time to invest time in yourself, this is kind of how you get to do that.
Yeah, and realistically, when we started brainstorming these ideas, they really fell into two categories. Some that were more of a financial commitment, and then some that maybe less expensive or even free, and more so just a time commitment and mental space commitment. So let's go ahead and start with the financial commitment action items here.
Yep. So it doesn't have to be a lot of money, but if you have some money to invest, one of the easiest things that you can do is to actually take a class or a workshop. It can be in a new style, it can be in a new medium. It's a way for you to learn some tips or techniques that you can incorporate into your own practice later.
Yeah, and I think my favorite part about taking classes, I've only done a handful since really diving back into my creative practice, but being someone who absolutely loves routine, it's really cool, like immersing yourself in someone else's creative practice, because you see what are ways that they warm up, what are ways that they get in the flow with their process. And also, if you're doing one that's in their physical creative space, whether they're a studio or maybe a classroom, just getting into a new atmosphere can really shift your creative energy and the way you interact with the work that you're making.
Yeah, so whether online or in person, another huge consideration is that some of these classes are going to have different time commitments and also different types of structure. So you may be talking about a 4-hour class on a weekend. You could be talking about once a week, 6-week workshop. Could be talking about a 6-month structured program or something a little bit more like, a college type, level course, and it's different structures. But what you want to do is you definitely want to shop around for what fits your learning style and your availability of time. So no need to commit to something that's 6 months, Thursday nights every week if, oh no, now it's stopping with other things you want to do in your life. So definitely take a look at that and then pick something that fits accordingly.
Yeah, one huge perk of in-person workshops, though, whether you're in a group of 5 people or 20 people, is you really get to feed off that energy of other people in class. So, like you were saying, whether it's a one-time class or an ongoing relationship that you can build over 6 weeks, really being able to feed off the positive, creative energy and creative backgrounds of other people you're doing your class with can be a huge benefit if you do decide to do one in person.
Yeah, plus a lot of times there might be ideas that pop up, that somebody's like, "Oh, I just thought of this," or sometimes it's like somebody will ask a question you didn't know you had to the instructor, and then it just kind of brings up even more ideas. But there is a caveat or, kind of a disclaimer. If you're going to be taking classes or workshops, this is something I learned from another artist who does teach a lot. She's, hardcore instructor, but she basically said, something you want to be careful of is not to turn into a workshop tourist. This is what she calls it,
Mm.
where you just go from class to class, workshop to workshop. You end up repeating everything that's done in the class, and it almost overrides, so to speak, what you would normally do or what you may think of as your style. Instead of taking the class as a way to learn new techniques and tools that you can add to your existing tool belt, so to speak. So it's not that you can't, it can definitely be a social activity. It's up to you if you just want to take anything with you or not. But ideally just keep an eye out that it's not, oh, I took this class and now the art I make looks exactly like what the instructor makes, and it's just them echoed in it instead of yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing with workshops. It's taking that knowledge that you learned in the class and then reapplying it to your own creative practice. So, even if the painting or the sculpture or whatever it is that you make inside the workshop does really look like the style of the artist you're taking the class from, then after the workshop, coming home, maybe even bring that piece home with you and assessing, okay, what did I learn? What did I like? What got me out of my comfort zone in a good or maybe a bad way? And really taking that and then saying, okay, what am I then going to decide to apply to my current style? So that way you're not just rinse repeating 10 paintings in the style of the artist that you took the workshop with, but maybe your current style changes slightly based on what you learned. And this can be happen from being exposed to new materials, new techniques, and materials, especially, I think, is the biggest benefit of talking with other artists or going to an art store or going to a workshop, because really switching up your materials will ultimately change your creative process. And so, another tip that we have for reigniting your passion is investing in quality materials. Because realistically, incredible art can be made with inexpensive materials. You don't have to break the bank on every single piece, get the best of the best all the time. However, as a general rule, if you can buy the best you can within your budget, that can affect the quality of the work in the end, as long as it's not so expensive that it's really holding you back in your process. If you have a small tube of paint that is way out of your budget to the point where you're so scared to use it, that's not going to do your process any good because it's probably going to stay in the tube. So finding that balance of when does it make sense to level up the quality of your materials so that the end product can benefit versus being so scared to use it is not exactly ideal.
I know. I like to think of it as the dime size syndrome, where you'll see artists and they just put this tiny little blob of paint, especially if it's acrylic. Then they have to remix everything again when they run out, and then it leads to frustration. The colors don't match, anyways. You get the point. It creates a bottleneck in the process. That's if it even leaves the tube of paint. So definitely on camp, buy decent quality. Some craft paint you really want to stay away from because it could flake. And if you're selling your work, you don't want to sell something that will break down 2 years from now or even less, right? But there's a lot of student grade materials that you can get that will work perfectly fine. Like, say, I'm just going to throw an example, right? There's plenty of professional artists that use something like Liquitex Basics, which is considered student grade, but it won't flake off like the 50-cent Walmart paint will, you know what I mean?
Right.
And if you're going to be using it in a background layer, it's not as important. That the nice paint can still stick to the top of that just fine, no adhesion problems. no issues for it down the road, right? And what goes on top is the most important thing anyways. And also, this always cracks me up. I've never heard anyone ever, a gallerist, a collector, other artists. I think only people that really ask are other artist friends. Nobody else really cares what brand of paint you use. Honestly, they may care if it's oils or acrylics, and honestly, that's about it. They don't care if you use golden. They don't care if you use Liquitex Basic. So, if that's coming into your head, that's not as important. Now, will the pigment load, aka the quality of the paint, right, be better in the top shelf tequila? Yes, it will. But especially if you're learning and it's a new one, you kind of want to go for middle of the road. You know what I mean? You don't want to go the cheapest. And if you have all the money to spend and you want to go for top shelf, go for it, right? Knock yourself out. But whatever it is needs to be where you're comfortable enough that you can put it out on the palette and not feel like you have to be stingy on it. Also, with that comes in mind, you can use the most expensive paint on earth, and it's not going to reflect the quality because it cannot make up for lack of skill or practice. So you can use the most expensive stuff, but if you're new, it's not going to help. You know what I mean?
Right.
Now, if you use the super cheap stuff, you're going to end up so frustrated that maybe you won't even move further. So that's where we're like, okay, yes, spend the best you can, and a quick hot tip on this one is if you are going to splurge a little bit more, do it with the colors that you are going to use the most. You mix almost everything out of magenta, primary yellow, and cyan. Get your black if you use black or Payne's gray. Prefer that one for sure. And your white, and you can mix almost everything. So you could perhaps do those on the better quality stuff, your main mixing colors, and then fun colors out of something a little bit less expensive so that you can still experiment and not have to mix everything from scratch. But anyways, I'll just leave it with that. Otherwise, I'll go into a technical rabbit hole of like, yes, you can, but no, you don't have to buy all the things super expensive for sure.
Exactly. And it's all about finding that balance. And really, by investing in quality materials, it can change your relationship and probably will with your creative process. But another thing that I always think about is display. So, having gotten my master's in exhibition design and going around to galleries and museums trying to figure out how did they hang this? Why did they hang this on this wall rather than that wall? Display is really a prominent thing for me that I always think about with my creative practice, and is one thing that can really change a relationship for the entire process. So let's say if you're working on maybe some panels or some canvas, if you complete a painting and then it stays sitting on your table, you may have a different relationship with it once you hang it up on the wall, once you put it in a float frame, once you see it in a space other than laying flat on the floor or your table. So, really investing in elevated display systems will help the way you see your artwork and make you see it in a different way. So, float frames, if you decide if you work on paper, you can get magnets so that it pins straight up to the wall without having to poke holes in it. Investing in some D rings and hanging wire so that you can get your panels up on the wall. If you have a space to where you're displaying work and it's kind of rotating what you're showing, you can invest in a cable system so that there's not constant holes in the wall. Or if you do a lot of markets, in-person shows, maybe you invest in new display systems for the artwork there. All these different things to really not just elevate the work that you're making, but how you're presenting it. Because how people, yourself included, or your future collectors interact with the artwork and experience the artwork really does affect your relationship with it in the end.
Yeah, it does. And with that too, if you're unsure of which of those different systems to use or how would it look and I'm not ready yet, super easy trick is you can put your artwork on a mantle, for example. So it's more eye level, it's elevated. It costs you literally nothing, or on a
Yeah.
shelf or on a table, whatever you've got, lean it against something so that you can see it, see if it feels complete before spending your precious pennies, again, depending on your budget, on an elevated system. But definitely super highly recommend you do end up putting it up at the kind of view that you expect your collector to see it at. And then that way, if there's any minor tweaks in it or whatnot, you can go ahead and knock those out. But some less expensive or free options to think about. A lot of these are more focused on, time and mental investments, is taking the time to experiment, right? So it's super important. This is something, circling back to something we said earlier about, taking a break, whether it's a block or you actually need a break, you need time to play and experiment. This is a lot of times where, without giving yourself the pressure of like big, heavy expectations, you can generate new ideas for what's coming next. So you can do this by trying new mediums and getting back into beginner brain, at least for temporarily, taking some of that burden off of yourself. You can do some creative prompts, plenty of them online, of course. And we have a few episodes that talk about different prompts. Another fun one, and this is one of my favorites, honestly, is to exchange materials with other artists and or collaborate on a project. So if you're like, I don't know about new mediums, we literally just talked about like investing in quality stuff, but you're like, budget may not allow it, then consider an exchange with another artist that uses those materials that you're curious about and saying, hey, how about that gesso for that oil stick? Let's see what happens, right? And just swapping or lending each other materials so you don't have to spend the money, or working together on something and just bringing materials together, see what happens.
Yeah, and in that same light of really like collaborating with other people, one thing that I found is super helpful that really doesn't cost you much money up front, if I'm really wanting to put kind of like a fire under my creative process, is researching a new topic and then responding to it. So, especially if your work is very conceptual, if you're responding to a different ideas or different concepts, then diving in and just doing that rabbit hole deep dive with a new topic can be super exhilarating with your work. So maybe purchasing a few books everywhere from autobiographies to technique-based coffee table books. Maybe it's a personal development book on something that you're struggling with so that you then want to process it through your art making. Maybe it's doing Skillshare videos or YouTube videos of an actual technique, but something that you're consciously deciding, I'm going to make artwork either exploring this idea, exploring this concept, or exploring this new thing that I'm learning, can be super awesome, because then it's also, you become a beginner again in your process. And so it really forces you out of your comfort zone and not just learn something new, but respond to something new too.
Yeah, and sometimes with that rabbit hole, it's the opposite. It'll end up being not just beginner brain, but actually mastery in a way.
Mhm.
Learning that language, circling back to something you said, Jackie, about like discovering what you like and what you don't, and then seeing how that applies to your work. So, say, for example, you decide to research a historic art movement. I don't know, Art Deco, or maybe like
Right.
block printing in Japan in medieval times, whatever it is, right? But you may start as that beginner brain, but then you start noticing, I like this, and then that rabbit hole keeps getting deeper and deeper, and before you know it, you're like talking about, oh, Hasegawa did this in the 14th century. I don't know, I'm making that up, but basically embracing that, right? It's not a detour, it's research. It's not a distraction, it's research. You decide how much of that then you incorporate into your work and definitely enjoy it while you're doing it. So I definitely love looking at historic art movements and seeing what is it about them that captures me. It doesn't mean I'm going to replicate it in my work, but they could definitely inspire things in my work or inspire me to research different techniques or different aesthetic looks in my work. So definitely worth looking into. Another one is like either poetry or different kinds of writing that you find inspiring, could spark something for you. And then also, well, we say this one a lot, spending time in nature, go outside, it's free. Oh my god, it's as free as it gets, right? But same thing, like, is it a leaf pattern that calls out to you? Is it something in a rock and like the texture that's in it? whatever it is for you, right? And seeing how that, again, rabbit holing it in a way, maybe you have a sketchbook with you, but like trying to observe essentially what is it that calls out to you, and then using some introspection to figure out, okay, how does that show up in my work? Or is it just fuel, to like refill my tank, but it doesn't have to literally show. It's completely up to you.
Exactly. And I think that really touches on, that physical and mental health aspect of the creative process. As we've talked about on previous episodes, of like, you can't fully show up for your creative practice unless you're fully showing up for yourself first. Because that's what makes the creative practice and buying original artwork and investing in artists so powerful, is that so much of us as artists goes into our work. So if you're exhausted, if you're burnt out, if you're any of these things, then your work will be affected by it. And so really focusing on physical health and mental health by going out in nature, maybe focusing on nutrition, trying some new recipes, especially when you start incorporating vegetables and different colors into your nutrition plan, or just weekly meals, then that can inspire maybe something in your studio or just give you that fuel. Painting, you don't think of it as an endurance activity, but if you get physically or mentally tired after creating for 30 minutes or an hour, what would happen if you try to paint for 6 hours straight? Do your legs start to hurt? Does your back start to hurt? And so really focusing on taking care of your physical health can affect your studio practice that way too. And just when it comes to moving your body, whether it's full on workouts in the gym, whether it's nature walks, maybe it's just having a daily dance party at your home with your kids, that movement produces endorphins. That movement can really build excitement in your body and spark some creative energy too. And of course, the number one that everyone talks about is making sure that you're getting enough rest, making sure that you're drinking enough water, really just taking care of your body. Because if you are going on negative 10% fuel, falling asleep at your studio table, you might not make the most amazing masterpiece work that you've ever made. Making sure that you get that rest, both physically and mentally, so that you can really be fully present when you are taking the time in your studio.
Yeah. And if you don't rest enough, you can get fog brain. And if you get too much of a fog brain, you can't paint or whatever your art is. So there's that. But to sum all of this up, think of it much like our journeys where we grow up going to school, where we, go through the different levels. Progress always requires time and oftentimes money as well, for you to spend on yourself and also your art in order to evolve. So with that, we're going to leave you. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
As always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes, where you can find episode notes and links to all of our podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share what you have learned, you can follow us on social media at Might Have Rained Art across all platforms.
And I am at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Or if you want to stay connected with the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.